Esther 1:10-12. On the seventh day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. And at this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. For the next few moments, I'd like us to consider the subject, #MeToo. #MeToo. Lord, as we consider the book of Esther, and as we consider the subject, #MeToo, I ask, Lord, that you will speak to us through your word, and that you will also help us to stand up against those who abuse their power, especially against women. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. We do still have much work to do, but we are fortunate enough to live in a society that is increasingly empowering women to say no to powerful men. The Me Too movement, which I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have heard of by now, was started in 2006 by the African-American activist Tarana Burke, who, following her own experiences, wanted to raise awareness of the pervasive issue of sexual abuse and assault in society. Following the exposure of widespread sexual abuse allegations against powerful men in industries such as the film industry, the #MeToo movement went viral as celebrities and women from all walks of life used it to join with the movement, saying that there are no circumstances under which harassment, abuse, and assault are okay. And I'm proud to say that those sentiments are very much held within our church today. And let me say it again. Harassment, abuse, and assault are not okay. As the Me Too movement went forward, case after case emerged as well-respected, or rather previously well-respected celebrities, business and religious leaders proved not to be immune to the movement. And there was a growing sense that no matter who you were, no matter what position you held, especially if you were a man who abused your position over women, you would be held to account. One of the dynamics that the Me Too movement shed further light on was the fact that within relationships there are power dynamics that can sometimes be such that those who want to say no are effectively silenced, because those who might be asking them to do things or engage in certain activities are held some sort of sway, authority, or power over them. Some of you might be saying, well, Julian, we know about Me Too. We agree with the Me Too movement, but what does Me Too have to do with Esther? I'm glad you asked. You see, I would like to suggest to you today that the book of Esther gives us insight to a #MeToo movement that took place many years ago in the ancient Near Eastern kingdom of Medo-Persia. You see, as you read the book of Esther from chapter 1, If there's one thing that the book wants to communicate to us, if there's one thing that comes through clearly in the text, it is the fact that King Ahasuerus was an extraordinarily powerful man. You see, if you read chapter 1, we are told that Ahasuerus ruled over 127 provinces, all the way from India to Ethiopia. We're told that as we meet Ahasuerus in this point in chapter 1 in the text, that he gave a banquet in verse 3 for all of his officials and ministers, the army of Medo-Persia, the nobles, governors of the provinces, that all of these people were present, and that he was displaying in verse 4 the wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for many days. Listen to how many days now: 180 days in all. And it doesn't stop there. Verse 5. When these days were completed, you see, after 180 days, it's still not enough. When these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, in this city, both great and small, he gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. After all of that, he then throws a feast for the city. Ahasuerus was a powerful man. He controlled a vast amount of territory. But you see, not only was he powerful and influential, but he was extraordinarily wealthy. And what's interesting is that in verse 6 and onwards, we almost start to go into an episode of grand designs or extraordinary homes. You know, those shows where they take you to a house that maybe you might aspire to one day live in yourself. The text, like Grand Designs, takes us on a tour around his palace. And just before we go there, I think to sort of help us to conceptualize what it might have been like in Medo-Persia, I think it's useful for me to communicate to you that the word paradise comes from an old Persian word. You see, there's one thing that Persians were known for, and that was their gardens, beautiful gardens. And we're told that the feast is taking place in the king's garden, in his paradise. As the text takes us on a Grand Designs like tour, we are told of alabaster columns. We're told that there was mother of pearls in the mosaic. We're told of all sorts of luxurious cloth hangings. We're told that there were fabrics made of bluish purple, which were not easy to produce because the dye for these fabrics came from the glands of a small purple snail, which had to be retrieved by divers in the Atlantic ocean and caught in their thousands in order to make purple. We are told, and through all of these rich, luxurious hangings and trappings, we are taken on a tour of the riches of the empire that King Ahasuerus lived over, even, or rather ruled over. Even the curtains, we are told, were made of silver. This chapter establishes Ahasuerus's power, his wealth, his influence. He was one of the most powerful men in the world at this time, and the book of Esther wants us to know. And having built this very deliberate picture of the king's wealth and his largesse and his power, the text then goes on to describe that in this period of the banquet, He's in the presence of the most powerful and influential men in his empire. We're told that with these powerful leaders, these other powerful leaders, he's drinking and partying. They're denying themselves nothing. They're celebrating. They're feasting. And we're told that the women of the palace had another banquet also. Picture the scene now as the king, in the midst of his feasting, calls to the eunuchs, asking them to bring the Queen Vashti before him so that all can behold her. Imagine that King Ahasuerus, the most powerful man in the ancient Near East at that time, effectively a god on earth, a man of unparalleled power, calls Vashti to his side, and she says no. When was the last time that you said no to someone in a position of power? Vashti said no. Now, let us not underestimate what it would have taken to say no like Ahasuerus. Well, sorry. Let us not underestimate, rather, what it would have taken to say no to a powerful man like Ahasuerus. As I mentioned in the beginning, one of the dynamics of the Me Too movement is that it has made more prominent the fact that when people find themselves in situations where somebody who has power or authority over them asks them to do something, because of that power dynamic, it has led to many feeling that they cannot say no. And that happens with people at work, people in the community. Imagine what it would have taken to say no to a man like Ahasuerus. Vashti stood up and she said no. Now, this was a powerful act. And I think we often glance over the story of Vashti because we're interested in Esther. But I want to suggest to you that we cannot fully appreciate what Esther did if we don't take the time to consider the actions of Vashti. Now, one of the really interesting things about this passage is that, you see, it seems to me, and we can get this impression from the king's reaction to Vashti. You see, it seems to me that King Ahasuerus was not somebody who was used to people telling him no. You see, when you acquire a certain amount of wealth, when you have a certain amount of influence, when you have power, you find yourself in a position where when what you say goes. And the more power that you get, the less people there are who are willing to stand up and say, well, hang on a second, maybe that's not what you ought to be doing. Perhaps there are some world leaders today who haven't heard somebody say no to them for a very long time. You see, this is how we can tell that King Ahasuerus was not used to people telling him no. You see, if my my if my if my wife and I were having a conversation and she said no, we would talk it out. We would sit down and say, okay, well, What do you think about this? What's making you hesitate about that? What does King Ahasuerus do? Now, read this in Esther for yourself. From verse 13, I would encourage you to go away and read it for yourself. So, verse 12, Vashti refuses to come. Verse 13, does the king sit down and have a conversation with her? No. The king, having heard no, consults his lawyers. Listen to this. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged and his anger burned within him. Verse 13, then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws. Vashti says no, and the king starts seeking legal advice. It's as though Ahasuerus is shocked. It's as though he doesn't know what to do with himself. A woman has told him no. He must be thinking, doesn't she know who I am? Doesn't she know that I could have called any woman in the empire to be my wife? Doesn't she know how I rule over what was it, 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia? Hasn't she seen the kind of drapes that I have on my wall? Doesn't she know that she's stepping on mother of pearl mosaics? The king is confused. He's not used to being told no by a woman. And so what does he do? He goes and discusses it with his mates. He goes and discusses it with his lawyers, and fascinating stuff. Look at the conversation that they have. Verse 16. Then Memucan, listen, Memucan is one of those characters who loves to stir the pot. Watch how Memucan stirs the pot. Verse 16. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only has the queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. Verse 18, he's not finished, Verse 18, this very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Medes and Persians, so that it may not be altered, that 1. Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another, who is better than she, so that when the decree is made by the king, and it is proclaimed throughout all the kingdom, vast as it is, 2. All women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. I know I read quite a bit there, but can you see what's happening? The king, Vashti has said no to the king. The king is not quite sure what to do with himself, so he seeks a legal solution. And maybe that's because of pride. The king is not willing to enter into a conversation, so he seeks a legal solution to his difficulties without first going to speak to her. And this group of men, they gather around and they discuss what's going on, and they come to this conclusion that, well, Vashti is setting a bad example for all of the other women. They conclude that, if we don't make an example of Vashti, then perhaps there are other women in the kingdom who will look at Vashti's example and say no to their husbands too. And so they conclude that Vashti will be sent away, the king will get a new wife, and then by engaging in these courses of action, they will resolve the situation, and that by legislating that women will respect men, the problem will be solved. I mean, there is so much toxicity in this situation that I think it would take a whole other sermon series to unpack the dynamics that are taking place there. But I say all of this to make the point that Vashti said no to a powerful man, and she paid the price of being cut off from society. In fact, Vashti's actions in saying no had an effect on all women in the empire. Because following this incident, the law was made, right? And so now it was a legal requirement, right, for all women to respect their husband. And that legislation that was passed following Vashti Gate would have impacted Esther also. For Esther was also a woman living, a Jewish woman living in the kingdom of Medo-Persia. Now you know the story. You know how Esther was brought in to the king's house, replacing Vashti. You would know how she had an uncle whose name was Mordecai, who uncovered a plot against the king and exposed it. You would know how he upset Haman, one of the king's advisors, and so Haman plots now against the Jewish people. Haman gets a law passed that basically allows people to kill the Jews, and so Mordecai goes to Esther, and Esther's aware of the situation, and so then what happens is that Esther has to go in to the king to lodge a petition that would help her people to be saved. Listen to Esther 4, verse 14. Well, let's read from verse 13. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape more than all the other Jews, for if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." You see, for Esther to present herself before the king without first being invited, she risked death. You see, that is one dynamic. But the dynamic that we often don't appreciate is the fact that the king had had an issue with his previous wife not doing what he wanted her to do. And so not only was Esther risking herself by not having been invited, by going in, Esther was potentially exposing herself to the accusation that she is being disobedient, like Vashti was being disobedient. Esther would have known what happened to Vashti. Esther would have known what happened to the last woman who disobeyed an order of a powerful man. Esther would have seen how he shunned her. Esther would have seen how he cut Vashti off. Esther would have seen how the king manipulated those around Vashti to turn him against her. Esther would have seen how the king got his other male friends to ridicule her, how she was discussed, how she was spoken ill of, how they made all sorts of insinuations against her. Esther would have seen what happened to the last power woman who stood up against a powerful man. Esther knew. Walk through the text. You can see she asks her people to fast and pray. She knows the context. She knows the cost. And she decided that in this situation, if death was the price for saying no to those laws preventing her from going to see the king, then that was the price she was willing to pay. And what's all the more remarkable is that as Esther goes to present herself before the king in Esther 5, she has no guarantee that she will even have the opportunity to make the petition in the first place. Esther 5, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes. She stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne. Inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The golden scepter, he held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" You see, when Esther stood at the entrance to the king's throne, she had no idea whether her petition would be heard or not. Imagine what it would have taken for her to get dressed that morning, to put on her clothes, to take the walk up to the king's throne room, knowing what this king had done to Vashti, another woman, his previous wife. What strength, what character, What a singular sense of purpose and mission Esther demonstrates in her actions of standing up in front of King Ahasuerus. She knew that there was a chance that she could die. But she was willing to forego her own life of luxury in her pursuit of duty to her people. There was a chance that she would not even be heard, but because there was still a chance that her actions could impact on saving others, she was willing to put her own life at risk. And in her willingness to pay the price of death, I would suggest to you that Esther, here in the book of Esther, is not all that dissimilar to Christ. When he saw the cross, he recognized that death was the price that needed to be paid. And he went forward and paid that price anyway. In our world, in our church today, we need people who are willing to put and to join hashtag me too to their names. We need more people who, like Esther, who, like Vashti, who in the face of influence, and overwhelming power, influence, wealth and authority, are willing to stand up and pay the price that sometimes needs to be paid for the salvation of others. When Vashti said hashtag me too, she was alienated. But when Esther said hashtag me too, it led to a mighty work of the Lord's salvation. It's a difficult subject because those two women illustrate that standing for rights, yes, sometimes it can bring about the intended effect. But in other circumstances, it can come at a heavy personal price. We live in a world that is in need of people who are willing to stand up and say no to people in positions of power and authority who abuse that power and authority. We see the devastating effect that is these power dynamics are having on our world today. Not only in terms of the relationships between men and women, but also in terms of the relationships between nations. Perhaps God is calling us to be more like Vashti and to be more like Esther. In some cases, it may come at personal cost, but in other cases, it may lead to the salvation of others. Let us stand up and say no. Let us stand up and say #MeToo. Amen.